Hello, my name is Josiah Boucher from WPI in the Computational Media Program, and I'm going to talk about my paper, How Do You Want to View This? Generative AI, Creative Ethos, and Tabletop Role-Playing Game Hobbyists. So I'm going to start off by talking a little bit about the study that I did, the research space we're operating in, the motivations, this sort of thing, and then I'm going to go into the findings and the framework that we developed from this. So to start us off, I'm looking at the intersection between generative AI and tabletop role-playing games. So this is sort of an alternate angle to approach critical AI literacy. Tabletop role-playing games are a low-stakes, sort of non-professional creative environment, and this provides a nice contrast to sort of the dominant study that I see out there where it's looking at productivity, it's looking at efficacy, efficiency of generative tools, particularly in a professional domain. And there are a lot of sort of concerns that come with that domain that aren't present here. Another reason I'm looking at this space is that tabletop role-playing games are already engaging in generative practices. If you're not familiar with this, a lot of the time a tabletop role-playing game is a group of people sitting around a table engaging in communal storytelling, often rolling dice to see if they properly attack a monster or convince somebody of their plan and this sort of thing. So there's something called an encounter table. So here's an example on the right where you roll a 100-sided die and it gives you what monsters you're going to fight. So this is a generative practice. And then there's also like map generation tools. Here's a blueprint of a building that was generated from a program. There's also plenty of examples of LLMs being leveraged for sort of emceeing this engagement or generating all sorts of other things as well. So we started off with a few research questions that we wanted to approach here. First is, what is the mental model of generative AI held by tabletop role-playing game hobbyists? How are they imagining it? We also wanted to know, how do these people navigate these complex questions of ethics as they grapple with this intersection of spaces, the introduction of generative AI into these hobbyist spaces? And then also, how might these players, these hobbyists, be empowered to adopt generative practices in a way that aligns with their definition of effective and ethical integration into their creative workflow? So we designed a study. We wanted to conduct semi-structured interviews. We had a list of questions, but we also wanted to be able to respond to the ideas that the interviewees were bringing up. And we also wanted to do this image generation activity using Stable Diffusion. So during the interviews, we would prompt people to give us a text prompt to input into Stable Diffusion to generate some images. Here are some examples of the sort of images we were producing. A lot of the time in tabletop role-playing games, players portray a character. So we asked them for a prompt that describes a character of their choosing, and then they generated these images, and that led to some really rich conversations. Some of these people had never before used generative tools, so it gave some really concrete examples that we could look through and walk through together that they had actually engaged in the creation of. And then we engaged in qualitative thematic analysis from all of these responses and this interview data that we gathered. An example of this prompt, so a text prompt somebody entered is, a young elven woman with dark silver hair stands in a dense forest. She has light gray eyes and wears a simple crown of antlers adorned with leaves. Her hair is half pulled back and has numerous braids. She wears simple clothing in natural colors and a hooded cape. And here's what that produced. Most of them were very similar to this, a few sentences, not terribly detailed, and they produced these images that they could then discuss with us. So to gather participants for this and recruiting, we gathered people who viewed themselves as participants of the hobby. We didn't sort of imbue any additional requirements or say you must play this game or have this amount of experience in it. And we asked them to self-report some demographic information. So here's their age, the gender breakdown of our participant population, and then the race or ethnicity as well. We noticed that snowball sampling, which we used in this, where we would ask participants if they know anybody who would be interested in participating in the study. That was our primary method of gathering recruits. This was especially effective in this domain. A lot of the time, people who play tabletop role-playing games, they play it with a group of other people, and so they already have sort of a group of other people who are likely to want to participate in similar things to them. So now I'm going to talk about the findings and the framework we developed from this study. So some of the major findings, rather than those questions of productivity and efficacy found in some of the more corporate or workplace-centered studies, our participants were asking questions like, who's making decisions about this technology, like LLMs and ChatGPT, this sort of thing? How do these decisions shape the systems that are made and the content that they produce? And also, how do we value AI-generated content compared to other artistic content? As well as what kind of uses of generative AI align with the tabletop role-playing game community values and experiences? And we thought that these questions represented a paradigm shift because rather than focusing on what does the tool accomplish, how quickly does it enable me to do work, this sort of question, these questions are much more focused on sort of ethics and creativity as well. So this diverged from the sort of corporate-centric narrative that typically exists and reflected this community with creative priorities. And particularly among our participants, we found that they are not separating ethical assessment and technology evaluation, but rather these things were sort of integrally connected for them. So the framework we created is called the Map and Compass framework. So the map here refers to sort of these artifacts. This is generative technologies, might refer to LLMs, this sort of thing. A generative application might be ChatGPT, other applications that leverage that technology. And then the generative content is, for example, those images we produced where the generative application spat out the content. And then the inquiries aspect of this are sort of where an inquiry was found among our participants, especially because these artifacts are what they tended to focus on, and these inquiries were where they directed their attention. So the training data that goes into LLMs, for example, the direction and sort of motivation behind the creation of the tool, these were very important parts to our participants. And then after a tool is made, you sort of engage in some kind of creative labor, whether that be developing a text prompt or something else. Sometimes people edit the outputs of things. So creative labor was another thing that had a lot of attention given to it. And then the distribution on platforms like Pinterest, for example, people found to be overrun with generative content. So these were sort of the primary inquiries that people faced. We also developed this term creative ethos. We found that the perceptions and reactions of our participants relating to generative AI tools were mediated through questions such as, how does someone feel about generative AI technology if they don't know where data is gathered for its training process, or how the generative AI products are distributed? Does this influence their use of generative AI tools or images produced by generative AI content? And what impact does this content have? How should they value or consider it alongside similar media? As well as, are there contexts in which they feel differently, and if so, why? An example of that last one is a lot of people sort of drew a boundary between situations where money was involved and whether it was not involved. So we sort of define creative ethos as this flexible variable that can change over time, shaped by someone's personal identity and experience, which describes the creative influence with which someone approaches, perceives, interprets, and creates media. And we sort of saw this as the foundation for ethically navigating the intersection of generative AI and creative domains, because this sort of colors how people filtered every way about how they interacted with it and what they thought about it. So the key takeaways here, the Map and Compass framework provides a model of tabletop role-playing game hobbyists' mental model of generative AI, and in doing so, it provides this point of comparison for similar domains of study that might be other non-professional creative domains. This study in particular highlights the value of continued exploration of niche domain spaces with diverse stakeholders. So, for example, we found really insightful differences compared to study of professional or corporate workplace sorts of contexts here. And lastly, the sort of major primary takeaway from our participants was that they perceived a particular entanglement of these development decisions relating to generative AI systems and the ethical priorities that go into making those decisions. And these two aspects they found to dynamically shape one another and were not detached. Thank you.